The interesting thing is whether you believe that he resurrected or not, still remains the fact that there ain't no one in the tomb. There's a
Right.
problem.
Well, that's the thing is Jerusalem's not very big.
Yeah.
You can go there today. Unfortunately, it's a little harder to get there right now because of October 7th. But yeah, you can still visit, and you can stand in the place where Peter was proclaiming that, up on the
So
Temple Mount,
cool.
and it's not a very far walk to whether it's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the traditional site, or if you're over at the Garden Tomb, which some people think today. Either one is not a very long walk, and if people, if Peter was lying and claiming that Jesus rose from the dead, they would just have to say, Peter, hold on a second, let's go check out this tomb. There's the body. No, stop lying to everybody.
Yeah.
And so that's why the empty tomb becomes so important, because what has to happen for the skeptic, they have to come up with an explanation as to how people were seeing him alive again, or at least thinking that they were seeing him alive again, if they were having visions or hallucinations or whatever. So they have to come up with some explanation to do away with people seeing him alive again. They have to also come up with the empty tomb, and not a single one of their theories that they've got does both of those. They'll come up with something for the empty tomb, like the women went to the wrong tomb that morning, or that the disciples came and stole the body, or they'll come up with something that tries to explain away the appearances, but nothing that explains both. And none of the views that they come up with hold any water at all. They all fall apart. And when you take two really bad views and put them together, it doesn't make it a better case. It makes it far worse.
Well, isn't there an argument, even when you're reading it, where it talks about the Pharisees or priests identify that Jesus they thought the disciples took the body and hid it with.
Yeah, so that was in Matthew 27 and 28. After the crucifixion, they go to Pilate and ask to have the tomb guarded, because they said, we remember while that deceiver was alive, he said that after 3 days I'll rise again. So his enemies just admitted that Jesus predicted his own resurrection.
That's so
So when you have your enemies saying that, that's a good thing. Historically speaking, that's what you want. You want your enemies giving the evidence for you, because then it's on pretty solid ground. But so command that the tomb be made secure, and so Pilate allows them to have a Roman guard to guard the tomb, and 3 days later, the angel rolls away the stone, and the guards shake like dead men, Matthew talks about, and of course Jesus had risen from the dead and starts making appearances, and the guard go back into town, and they tell the chief priest that, and they said, well, here's some money, and tell people that the disciples came at night and stole the body while you slept. And if this gets to the governor's ears, if Pilate hears about this, we'll appease them. We'll make you secure. Which proved it was Roman soldiers, by the way, if they're worried about what Pilate would do. And Roman soldiers did not sleep on the job. If they did, they faced a horrendous punishment. Polybius, the Roman writer, tells us what happened. If you failed your night duties as a Roman soldier, you would have your teeth ripped out, and then you would have to run the gauntlet. So every soldier in your company would make a tunnel, and you'd have to run through there while you're being beaten to death. And if you happen to survive that, you could go free, but nobody in the empire was ever allowed to offer you any assistance in any way, shape, or form.
Wow.
So that's what happened to Roman soldiers who fell asleep on the job.
Yeah.
They didn't. But here's the craziest thing. This is the number one argument they've got. In fact, the Jewish writers in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th century were still using it. When you look at the early church writings, the church fathers, they're arguing against Jewish people who are making this claim that the disciples came and stole the body at night. And so think about that claim. The disciples came at night and stole the body while we slept. How would sleeping soldiers know who stole the body?
Yeah.
So their best
good.
argument is an argument that contradicts itself.
Yeah.
And that's
such
the
a good
best one they've
point.
got.
And then you got to look at motivation of why they run and hide. They
Yep.
put a Roman soldier who the Roman soldiers had just beaten Jesus. They put him at the tomb. They seal the tomb because that word seal is a big deal. So somehow they have to unseal the tomb and then roll the stone away. They're already hiding. What's the motivation of even going and getting the body of a man that everything they believed was about him and his life and who he would be. In some respects, you even see that they still kind of believed he was going to be a revolutionary leader. They didn't fully see him as this leader of the world, the king of the world yet, and the kingdom of God. So it's hard to conjure up a motivation even for why they would want to go take this body of a man.
Yeah, not only would they have the inability to do so, to overpower the Roman guard, these are fishermen.
Yeah.
They're not going to overpower trained Roman soldiers without anybody knowing about it. And why wouldn't the Roman soldiers say that? They overtook us, they beat us up, not they came while we were sleeping. So that doesn't make any sense. But yeah, the motivation, in fact, if you put yourself in the Jewish mindset of the time, the law said, "Cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree." Yeah. Jesus was just hanged on a tree, on a cross, meaning they would have considered him cursed by God, which is exactly what Isaiah 53 predicts. And so why would they go and they would have thought that he was a fraud, that, we followed him. We thought he was the one, but he can't be. He died. And that's even what Cleopas and one of the other unnamed disciples in Luke 24 on the road to Emmaus talk about, that they start telling, when Jesus appears to them, they don't realize it's Jesus, that he asks what's troubling them, and they essentially say, well, there was Jesus, we thought he was the one who was going to do all this, but they killed him. And that's when Jesus said, "Oh, foolish ones and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have written, ought not the Messiah come and suffer and die and do this?" So he's pointing to Old Testament prophecy saying, this is what was predicted, you should have known. And when Paul went into the synagogues in Acts 17, Acts 18, that was his custom, was to go into the synagogue to preach the gospel to the Jews first. That's what he would do. He would go through all these prophecies in Scripture showing people that the Messiah was supposed to suffer and die and then rise again. And they didn't understand that, because they were expecting somebody who would ride in on the white horse and conquer the Romans and then set up the kingdom. And even after the resurrection, right before Jesus ascends into heaven, the disciples are, "Hey, Jesus, at this time, are you going to set up the kingdom?" And he's like, "It's not for you to know the time. Just do what you're supposed to do. You're going to be my witnesses in Judea and Samaria, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." And that's what they became.
Wow. And there's even, for an extra biblical source, what I thought was interesting, and I had actually was telling him about this on a previous podcast, was the Nazarene or Nazareth inscription?
The Nazareth inscription. Yep.
Yeah. Can you elaborate on that? You'll explain it far better than I tried to.
Yeah, so some people may have heard of this a few years ago. There was an article that came out where somebody was able to do some testing on this marble tablet that was found in a museum. I think it was in London, in the museum there, British Museum of Natural History, and it just had a little note on it that said, "From Nazareth," and so that's why people called it the Nazareth inscription. And but if you look at what it says, it is a rescript, so like a summary of a law that was passed by Emperor Claudius, who reigned in the 40s AD, so like 10 to 15 years after the crucifixion and resurrection. And here's what the law says, that it is capital punishment for anybody who moves a body from a tomb with wicked intent. And it specifically mentions sepulchre-sealing stones, which are found only in Israel. Wow. So you have a law passed by the emperor himself telling people they cannot move bodies from a tomb with wicked intent. Well, what could have possibly happened recently at that time that had something to do with people moving a body from a tomb? Well, let's see. Wherever the disciples went, they proclaimed Jesus rose. And then what happened? The Jewish leaders and other people would say, no, the disciples came and stole the body while the soldiers slept. And so in some places, like in Ephesus, it actually created riots. And Rome doesn't want riots in their empire, so he passes a law saying nobody can. That's a perfect explanation for it. Now, the article that came out a few years ago did some testing on where the marble came from, and they're like, well, it didn't come from Nazareth. Well, we knew that already. Yeah. There's no marble in Israel. They have to import all of it. And then he's like, oh, it came from the island of Kos, and there's this guy, this wicked ruler back in like 60 years before Jesus that the people didn't like, and when he died, he was dragged out of his tomb. Well, yeah, but he had bars on his tomb, not a sepulchre sealing stone. And why would Caesar, he's saying it was passed by Julius Caesar, why would Julius Caesar care if somebody dragged the body of one of the enemies out of the tomb? Yeah. It doesn't make any sense. It's not called the Nazareth. It's not, people don't view it about Jesus because they think it came from Nazareth. They think it's about Jesus because of what it says.
Yeah. It doesn't make sense. Like why? And it's interesting. Like, because I think, Pastor James talks about this a lot, how we are very like isolated in our perspective of just like Bible thinking, but what it was around the world and how they viewed it during this time. Like there was other things going on at the time. And the interesting thing about this is that this reached the emperor. Like this was such an issue that's what I was finding interesting was like, wow, this news was relevant to the emperor enough where he's like, we gotta figure this out, and where he makes this weird law.
Well, and only 15, maybe 20 years later, you have another emperor who's a madman, Nero, who torches his own city, Rome, and then who does he blame?
Christians.
So even just within 20 years, you have Christians in Rome, where the emperor is just mad about it. And so, yeah, Christianity spread like crazy. And it didn't matter what you did to the early Christians, they would keep proclaiming Christ. In fact, I love that in Acts 4 and 5, where Peter and John get arrested. They're brought before the Sanhedrin. And they're like, you need to stop preaching in Jesus' name. And yeah, whatever. I mean, paraphrasing. you can decide if that's whatever. But, we can't help but tell people what we've seen and heard. So they go right back and start preaching. They get arrested again. Didn't we tell you to stop preaching in his name? And they beat him. And they rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. Yeah. And the worst thing you could, and think about it as a Christian, the worst thing the world can do is take your life. And that for us means graduation. We get to go, Paul says, for me to live is Christ, to die is gain.
Yeah.
And all of that based on the resurrection. It all comes back to the resurrection, our faith of, being able to have an adventure and not worry about life or death because we're on an adventure here, and the resurrection gives you that peace.